The winter I was born, the village oracle promised my mother a son with shoulders broad enough to carry the family name. My parents trusted him so completely that they hid from the census team, borrowed money for celebratory wine, and picked out a boy's name before I had even drawn breath. When I came into the world, red-faced and screaming and unmistakably female, the room went quiet in the way a room does when everyone suddenly remembers a funeral they forgot to attend. My grandmother gathered up the eggs she had brought for my mother and carried them home, again without saying a word. My father wrapped me in a grain sack instead of a blanket. He told my mother not to cry because tears wasted water in winter. Then he walked out into the dark with me in his arms and said he was taking me to where bad luck belongs. He might have left me by the road if the Vale family had not been returning from town just then, their cart lanterns swinging gold over the frozen ruts. Mrs. Mara Vale heard me before anyone else. She always said my cry sounded less like a baby and more like a kettle refusing to stop boiling. Mara Vale was the kind of woman who noticed every small thing the world tried to hide. She noticed the sack in my father's arms. She noticed his guilty pace. She noticed, too, that the sack moved when the wind hit it. By the time her husband Anton reined in the mule, she already knew. Enough to be angry. "What are you carrying?" she asked. My father lied. He said it was spoiled grain. Mara stepped forward, tore the sack open, and found my face blue with cold. Behind her stood her 3 sons in school coats too, short at the wrists, each with a book under one arm as if knowledge itself had come to witness my rescue. The eldest, Adrian, was 15 and severe in the way only boys who are good at mathematics can be. The second, Elias, spoke gently and read poems aloud to chickens, fruit trees, and cracked windows whenever he thought no one was listening. The youngest, Jonah, all elbows and restless cleverness, could take apart a clock and return it to life. Before supper, those 3 boys stared at me as if I were not an omen but a question. Mara Vale did not ask my father for permission. She asked instead what price he intended to put on abandoning a daughter. My father, seeing the lantern, the witnesses, and the village road beneath his feet, shrank into himself and named a sum no decent man would have said aloud. Anton paid him with the money meant for roof repairs. That was how I became the child no one wanted, and then, within a single breath, the child the Vale family refused to surrender. They named me Lark because Mara said a girl who had survived such a night deserved a name that rose instead of sank. The first week in the Vale house, I coughed until my whole body shook. Mara slept with one hand on my back. Anton pretended not to be worried, but when my fever climbed, he carried me 6 miles through sleet to the clinic and stood outside the treatment room with snow melting from his hair. Later I learned that he had been against taking me in at first. Not because he disliked me, but because the Vales were already living on a teacher's salary, a repairman's wages, and the wild optimism of 3 boys aiming for universities far richer children usually claimed a fourth mouth had seemed impossible. Then he heard me wheeze in my sleep and said impossibility could go starve somewhere else. I grew inside that house the way a seed grows in the crack of stone, not because conditions were easy, but because someone insisted life deserved room. Mara fed me broth with egg ribbons. Adrian folded old arithmetic papers into shapes and let me chew the corners while he studied. Elias read me stories before I knew words. Jonah carved my name into a scrap of pine and hung it above the narrow bed they cleared for me near the stove. The Vale brothers were known all through Frost Hollow as the scholar sons. Adrian ranked first in every county exam and solved algebra like he was arguing with the universe and expected to win. Elias wrote essays teachers copied to show entire schools. Jonah built windmills from broken bicycle spokes and once repaired the mayor's radio with a spoon, handle, and thread. People said Mara had been blessed with 3 golden sons. When they said it in front of me, they often lowered their voices as if I were merely the stray kitten sleeping under the table. But the brothers never let that stand. There are 4 of us, Jonah would say immediately. Adrian would correct anyone who forgot my place in the family register. Elias, who knew how shame works in a room, would simply move his chair until I sat between them. I learned early that being loved after being unwanted can feel suspicious. Even warmth can frighten a child who has known cold as a rule. I hid crusts of bread in the hem of my blanket because I was sure one day the cupboard would close to me. Mara found my secret stash and cried in the pantry where she thought I could not hear her. Anton built me a shelf after that. It was only 2 planks and 4 nails, but he sanded the edges smooth and said, "No one hides food in this house. If we are poor together." My birth family remained in the village and soon had the son they had prayed for. They dressed him in red cotton jackets and called him their rising sun. When they passed the Vale house, my mother would sometimes stop to stare at me in the yard as if she were trying to decide whether I had turned out prettier than regret. I had an older sister too, though I hardly knew her then. She would watch me from behind the fence with a look I only understood years later, the look of someone wondering what might have happened if rescue had arrived one child earlier. By the time I was 6, my cough had disappeared, my legs had grown sturdy, and the brothers had taught me enough letters to write my own name crookedly across the kitchen wall. Mara laughed when she saw it. Anton sighed, brought out paint, and gave me a whole board to practice on instead of punishing me. The Vale house was loud in all the best ways. Adrian muttered formulas into his rice. Elias memorized speeches while hanging laundry. Jonah whistled through missing teeth and made ambitious promises to someday build Mara a stove that never smoked and Anton a truck that never broke. They shared one desk, one lamp, and one future that seemed always just slightly too expensive. When I started school, I discovered I was not made from the same shining material as my brothers. Adrian absorbed facts like dry earth drinks. Rain. Elias remembered everything he ever read. Jonah understood mechanisms before adults finished explaining them. I, by contrast, had to work for every answer as if knowledge were a door bolted from the inside. The first time I brought home a test ranked in the middle of my class, I hid it under the flour tin. Adrian found it while looking for string. I cried because I thought he would be disappointed. Instead, he sat beside me, spread the paper on the table, and said, "Good. Now we know exactly what to fix." That became the pattern of my childhood. I was not the miraculous one. I was the persistent one. Adrian taught me to break large problems into smaller, humbler parts. Elias taught me that if I could not understand a text, I should read it aloud until its rhythm revealed its bones. Jonah turned multiplication tables into games involving bottle caps, marbles, and elaborate wagers over stolen peanuts. If they pampered me, they did it through work. Adrian sharpened my pencils before exams. Elias saved the orange centers from festival candies because he knew I liked them best. Jonah punched 2 extra holes into my school bag straps and threaded them with cord so it would not slide off my shoulders. Their care arrived not as speeches, but as practical miracles. The winter I turned 8, Frost Hollow held its annual river fair. Mara took all 4 of us because she had won a basket of vouchers for helping organize the school fundraiser. Snow threatened all afternoon but held off, and for once the town looked generous instead of worn thin. Lanterns lined the bridge. Vendors sold sugar spirals, hot chestnuts, and paper toys that spun in the wind. That was the day I noticed the boy in the red cap. He stood near the ferry steps with 2 strangers, a man and woman who kept smiling too widely whenever anyone glanced their way. The boy himself did not smile. His lower lip trembled. He was dressed in expensive wool, but his shoes were on the wrong feet, and one lace had been knotted by impatient hands. He kept twisting to look behind him as if waiting for someone who had promised to return. I tugged Mara's sleeve and pointed. "He looks lost," I said. Mara took one look and changed direction so sharply Anton nearly dropped the sack of flour he was carrying. By the time the strangers noticed they were being watched, Adrian had already slipped to one side, Elias to the other, and Jonah was shouting for the fair patrol with the unembarrassed force only a 13-year-old can produce. The strangers fled. The boy began to sob, not in the loud way children do when they want attention, but in gasping silent bursts that made his whole chest seize. Mara wrapped him in her shawl. Elias crouched beside him and spoke slowly until the child managed to point toward the magistrate's carriage at the top of the square. He was the deputy magistrate's grandson, and by sunset half the county seemed to know that Mara Vale and her scholar sons had stopped a kidnapping. That story did not turn us into rich people. Life is rarely so eager to reward goodness. But a week later, the deputy magistrate's wife sent medicine for Anton's bad shoulder, a sack of rice large enough to terrify the kitchen floorboards, and a letter recommending Mara for a permanent post at the county primary school. It was the first real door that opened because someone powerful had seen how the Vales behaved when no one important was watching. Mara got the job. Anton kept fixing machines at the grain depot, and because the family could now count on a steadier income, Adrian stopped talking about quitting school to work full-time. Elias entered a provincial riding competition and won enough money to replace our cracked window panes. Jonah received a scholarship for a junior science program in the city. In our house, fortune never arrived grandly. It came disguised as a little more air. My birth family noticed the change immediately. One spring morning, my mother appeared at the school gate carrying hard, boiled eggs and the expression of a woman rehearsing tenderness. She pressed the eggs into my hands and told every listening neighbor she had always kept an eye on me. When no one seemed impressed, she lowered her voice and asked if Mara really fed me meat more than once a week. I told her yes. She asked whether Adrian still outgrew his shoes quickly and whether the city scholarship gave Jonah spending money. I was only 9, but even I recognized inventory when I heard it. She was not counting love. She was counting advantages. My sister came with her once after that, thin from housework and already speaking with the weary caution of a much older woman. She touched the ribbon in my hair and smiled as if it hurt.
You're lucky, she said.
It was not accusation. It was an obituary for the child she had been. When I was 10, Anton fell from a loading platform at the depot. He did not break his back, though for 2 days the doctors feared he had. He shattered his knee, tore ligaments in one shoulder, and came home with a limp that stayed for the rest of his life. I still remember the way the house sounded after the news arrived, silent, not because nobody spoke, but because fear itself had weight. The depot owner wanted to blame Anton for standing on a loose board. After hours, Adrian arrived with dates, pay slips, and statements from 3 workers before the man finished his sentence. Elias drafted the appeal letter. Jonah, 14 and furious, stood in the office doorway and said nothing at all, which somehow frightened the owner more than if he had shouted. Anton kept his compensation, but it was not enough. Adrian took evening tutoring jobs. Elias translated pamphlets for a small newspaper. Jonah repaired radios and desk fans in a stall outside the bus station on weekends. Mara taught full days, then coached slower students after supper. I learned then that families do not survive hardship through noble speeches. They survive through lists, schedules, stubbornness, and the refusal to let one person carry the whole mountain. I wanted desperately to help, but I was still too young for paid work. Beyond peeling garlic for the noodle shop and folding boxes for the
pharmacy.
So I tried instead to become easier. I stopped asking for fruit. I wore sweaters until the elbows thinned to light. I took notes. In margins, I learned to split one eraser into 4 pieces and use each until it was almost dusk. Mara caught me turning down a school outing because it cost 6 yuan. That night, she sat at the edge of my bed and said something I have never forgotten. Do not confuse gratitude with making yourself small. She told me, we did not take you in so you could spend your life apologizing for existing. I cried so hard I scared myself. Adrian, who heard everything, pushed a scholarship application under my door the next morning. That was how I began collecting small awards, essay prizes, history, quizzes, county reading contests, a poster competition about river safety that Jonah insisted I enter because you owe the river fare a sequel. None of them were glamorous, but together they paid for textbooks, exam fees, and once a pair of proper boots that made me feel dangerously rich. Meanwhile, the brothers kept ascending. Adrian won admission to a top engineering high school in the provincial capital. Elias followed 2 years later to a humanities academy whose debating team had a national reputation. Jonah, true to form, won places at both and chose neither. He enrolled instead in the science school, attached to a technical institute because they promised him lab access, and a junkyard. Each departure tore something from the house, but it also stretched our idea of what was possible. Every time a brother left for somewhere larger, he wrote back, not just about exams and dormitories, but about libraries taller than churches, cafeterias with 5 kinds of soup, professors who asked students what they thought instead of merely what they remembered. Their letters were passports disguised as paper. They never forgot me while they were gone. Adrian mailed used practice books with meticulous notes in the margins. Question 12 is a trap, or you know more than you think. Slow down. Elias sent poems copied by hand and once enclosed a pressed ginkgo leaf. So yellow it looked lit from within. Jonah shipped home impossible. Contraptions, including a lamp powered by a bicycle wheel and a timer, made from springs that nearly exploded during dinner. When they returned during holidays, the entire village changed posture. Parents who had once said the veils were foolish for spending money on. Education began sending children to Mara for advice. Shopkeepers slipped Anton extra change and pretended not to notice. The same men who called daughters temporary guests suddenly boasted that perhaps a smart girl could also bring honor if handled properly. It was a disgusting revision, but at least it was progress wearing an ugly hat. My birth parents revised themselves too. Now that 3 scholar sons circled me like loyal moons, my mother began, calling me our lark in public. My father once tried to drape an arm around my shoulders at a funeral feast and asked Adrian whether engineering firms paid in the city as well as people say. Adrian removed my father's arm 1 finger at a time and answered, not to people who never studied. That was the year my sister appeared at our door after midnight with a baby tied to her chest and bruises on both wrists. Her husband's family wanted a son. She had produced 2 daughters and a 3rd pregnancy that had ended in blood and silence. She did not ask to stay long. She asked only for a ride to the county station and whatever Mara thought a woman would need if she intended never to return to the house that had called her wife only when servants were absent. Mara packed bread, money, sanitary cloths, and the address of a women's shelter in the city. Anton drove her before dawn. None of us spoke about it afterward because the village would have called it scandal. But I watched the road for a week after, imagining my sister moving farther and farther from the life that had bitten her and called its teeth duty. I was 12 when I first understood that I could not save everyone. I could only become the sort of person who left doors unlocked for the desperate. That realization changed my studying. Until then, I had worked hard because I loved the Veils and wanted to justify their faith in me. After that, I worked hard because I wanted leverage. I wanted money with my name on it, a room no one could evict me from, papers no one could re-rate, and the kind of education that turns pity into irrelevance. Still, compared with my brothers, I remained ordinary. No teacher ever looked at my test and gasped. No county newspaper photographed me receiving a prize. I did not seem built for brilliance. I was built for endurance. During long exam seasons, I rose before dawn, boiled eggs for Mara, revised vocabulary while stirring millet, and timed my bus rides by chapters. I got things wrong, corrected them, and got them wrong more usefully the next time. When I entered secondary school in the city, that steadiness saved me. The school was full of children who had grown up with piano lessons, private tutors, and parents who knew how to pronounce all the universities correctly. On my first day, I wore Adrian's altered coat, Jonah's repaired backpack, and a confidence Elias had written for me in a letter. If a room does not expect you, let that be the room's embarrassment. My grades were average at first, then slightly above, then stubbornly climbing. I discovered I had a knack for spatial reasoning and maps, geometry, floor plans, topographic drawings. These made sense to me in a way literature never quite did. I could imagine a building before it existed, trace a road before anyone laid stone, and understand the dignity of shelter as more than walls. Architecture entered my life, not through beauty, but through memory. I remembered the grain sack, the freezing road, the shelf Anton built, the room Mara cleared, the depot platform that failed him. I became obsessed with the idea that buildings can either betray a life or defend it. By 15, I knew I wanted to design schools, clinics, and houses that made it easier for girls like me to survive long enough to choose. When I said so at dinner, Jonah slapped the table and shouted that at last someone in the family had selected a practical form of genius. Adrian nodded once, which from him amounted to fireworks. Elias asked whether I intended to write beautiful buildings or merely useful ones. Mara said both. Anton said the roof should never leak and let the philosophers argue over the rest. Then came the marriage proposal. Not to me directly, of course. Men who traffic in daughters prefer to negotiate around them. I was 16 and had just received top marks in Technical drawing when my birth father arrived with a butcher from the neighboring county, a man with polished shoes and the soft, overfed hands of someone accustomed to owning labor instead of performing it. The butcher's mother had heard I was healthy enough, educated enough, and pretty in a quiet way. They offered a bride price large enough to clear my birth family's debts and buy their son a delivery tricycle. My mother, who had once wanted me left on a road, now praised my virtue as if she had crafted it herself. Mara shut the gate in their faces. They came back with relatives. Anton met them with a shovel. Adrian happened to be home for break and brought printed copies of child marriage statutes from the city. Elias, always the most dangerous when calm, asked the butcher's mother whether she wanted him to read her the penalties aloud slowly or quickly. Jonah filmed everything. The proposal died where it stood. But that night I shook so badly, Mara had to sit on the floor beside my bed until dawn. It was not the prospect of marriage itself that terrified me. It was how cheaply people I shared blood with could imagine selling the future I had built brick by brick. Study, Anton told me over breakfast the next morning after saying nothing for hours. Study until your name costs too much for fools to
pronounce.
I did. By the time I reached my final year of high school, Adrian was an engineer in Beijing, Elias was in law school, and Jonah was studying biomedical design with the sort of enthusiasm that made mentors alternately proud and exhausted. The village now referred to them collectively as the Vale Professors, though none of them had earned that title yet. Their old room at home remained crowded with medals, books, broken devices, and the ghost of years when 4 children shared one lamp. During my exam year, all 3 of them returned in shifts like an elite rescue team sent by heaven. Adrian reviewed physics and mathematics, drilling me on structural logic, until my nightmares became trigonometric. Elias handled language, interviews, and the fine art of not letting panic chew through my concentration. Jonah took over biology, nutrition, sleep schedules, and the maintenance of every appliance in the house because he claimed a malfunctioning fan could derail a whole academic future. Mara cooked. Anton walked me to the bus stop before every mock exam, even when his knee hurt in wet weather. Sometimes he carried my drawing tubes, even though they weighed almost nothing. I suspect he simply liked accompanying me where once he had been unable to go. I was never the student teachers warned others about. I was the student they used for a different lesson. If you are not born dazzling, one of my instructors said in front of the class, tapping my paper, be born relentless. I took that as a compliment. The summer before university admissions, my sister returned to Frost, hollow for the first time in years. She had cut her hair, found work in a garment cooperative, and arrived wearing a blouse she had bought with her own money. Her daughters clung shyly to Mara at first, then to me, then to Jonah's tool belt, which they treated as a magical candy dispenser. My sister sat with me under the apricot tree and watched me revise.
Do you ever hate them? She asked quietly, meaning our parents.
I thought about it for a long time. Not enough to waste my whole life carrying them, I said. She nodded as if I had handed her something she could finally set down. Results day came in heat so heavy even the walls seemed to sweat. Our internet failed twice. Adrian called from Beijing and shouted at the router through 3 provinces as though intimidation might repair the signal. Elias accused the website of class prejudice. Jonah paced in circles until Anton ordered him outside for the health of everyone present. When my score finally appeared, Mara sat down hard on the floor. I had not reached the highest tier in the country. I had not become a phenomenon, but I had done exactly what I needed, enough for a top architecture and public design program in Beijing, one with a scholarship substantial enough that even my pride relaxed. The house exploded. Anton laughed so loudly the neighbors came running. Mara kissed my forehead until I had to beg for air. Adrian, over speakerphone, said, "Good. About time." Elias cried openly and pretended the connection was bad. Jonah ran to the market and returned with watermelon, 6 steamed fish, and a cake bearing the icing words, "Our lark builds her own sky." My birth parents appeared before sunset. Of course they did. My mother brought eggs this time and a rehearsed face of suffering.
My
Father suggested that since education had been the making of me, I should naturally help finance my younger brother's vocational training, motorcycle, and future apartment. He spoke as though family were a bucket from which only one side had ever drawn water. I let him finish. Then I asked whether he planned to reimburse Mara for the medicine that saved my lungs, Anton for the years of fees and books, Adrian for tutoring, Elias for applications, Jonah for train tickets, or my sister for the childhood she lost in the house that had saved no one. He did not answer. The whole yard had gone quiet. Even the chickens seemed interested. I told them plainly that blood may be an accident, but parenthood is a long list of deliberate acts. Then I said the only inheritance I recognized had already been claimed: a shelf, a lamp, a set of sharpened pencils, a family who believed a girl could become more than someone else's bargain. My mother cursed. My father threatened. Anton stepped between us before either could advance. He no longer carried a shovel these days. Edge had moved him toward economy. Yet I have never seen two people retreat so quickly from a man merely folding his sleeves. The village talked about that scene for years. I did not care. I was leaving. Beijing was bigger than any letter the brothers had ever written could
Contain.
It smelled of rain on concrete, engine fumes, sesame oil, and possibility. Adrian met me at the station with a sign that said welcome. Architect of revenge, because subtlety had never been Jonah's contribution, and Adrian had apparently borrowed his sense of humor for the day. University taught me what childhood had not: how to belong in a room without first proving I deserved oxygen. My classmates were brilliant in ways that once might have frightened me, but I had been raised among brilliance. I knew now that talent is not a reason to worship someone. It is a reason to ask better questions. I worked harder than almost all of them. Not because I lacked pride, but because I had finally found the field in which my mind moved gladly: materials, science, social housing systems, school acoustics, modular classrooms, drainage, accessibility ramps, thermal retention in low-income buildings. These did not merely interest
me
they stirred me. I wanted to make structures that loved their inhabitants through competence. During my second year, I joined a studio researching rural school design. Most of the students wanted to create beautiful renderings.
I
Wanted to redesign dormitories so girls had locks, desks, and windows placed high enough that boys outside could not stare in. My professor called the project severe. I called it honest. He gave me an A and 2 additional grants. The Vale brothers never stopped hovering. Adrian reviewed my structural drawings on video calls. Elias negotiated my internship contract because he distrusted legal language on principle. Jonah, now deep into medical device research, arrived at my dorm one night with noise-canceling panels he had built from recycled foam because he said my roommates were too fond of midnight karaoke, and he had no intention of losing an architect to bad acoustics. People in my program envied me for having 3 overachieving brothers. What they did not understand was that I envied them too. I envied Adrian's certainty, Elias's ease with language, Jonah's fearless invention. Yet the older I grew, the more I saw the ways they envied me in return. Adrian envied my patience with communities. Elias envied my ability to choose a path and remain on it without romantic detours. Jonah envied, of all things, my steadiness. Love had not erased comparison from our family. It had simply made comparison tender instead of cruel. The first time a boy confessed to me in university, all 4 of them somehow knew within 48 hours. Mara asked whether he listened when I spoke. Anton asked what work he intended to do with his hands. Adrian requested his transcript as a joke. That was not entirely a joke. Elias warned me that people who admire resilience sometimes merely want to consume it. Jonah sent a detailed list titled Objective Indicators of Non-Idiotic Men. I dated no one serious then. A part of me remained too busy building myself. Another part feared choosing anyone who had not seen the house with the lamp, the shelf, the brothers half grown around me like a wall. I thought perhaps love would come late for me, if at all, and I made peace with that. Then, during graduate entrance season, I met June. He was not a prodigy. That is probably why I trusted him. He was a civil engineer working on a school safety audit pilot tied to my department's Housing lab. The first time we argued, it was over whether children care. More about color or temperature in classrooms. He lost the argument, brought me tea the next day, and asked if I would be willing to show him. The village schools I kept sketching from memory. I took him to Frost Hollow during summer review. He met Mara first and called her teacher Vale within 2 minutes, which secured him a place at the table. Anton studied his hands and nodded. Once, after seeing calluses, Adrian interrogated his drainage. Assumptions. Elias watched how he spoke to my sister's daughters. Jonah quietly took apart the flashlight June brought as a gift, improved it, and gave it back. Only after surviving all that did June ask whether he might hold my hand on the walk to the old river fairground. I let him. Love, when it finally came, was not a dramatic bolt. It was recognition. June never treated my history as tragedy that enhanced my charm. He treated it as infrastructure, the set of loads my life had borne, and the reinforcements I had built. That may sound unromantic. To me, it was the most romantic thing imaginable. Meanwhile, the family kept growing outward. Adrian married a transportation planner who could outstare him in meetings and beat him at chess. Elias fell in love with a documentary filmmaker and learned that good arguments can coexist with tenderness. Jonah refused to marry anyone until he had invented 3 things he considered useful enough to justify adult responsibility. Then he met a surgical resident who told him his criteria were ridiculous and married
Him, anyway.
At every wedding, someone cried more than necessary. It was always Anton. He cried when Adrian knotted his tie. He cried when Elias danced with Mara. He cried when Jonah tried to build a projection system for his vows and short-circuited half the venue. And when I married Jun under an autumn canopy in a courtyard lit by paper lanterns, Anton cried before. The ceremony even began solely because I had chosen shoes sensible. Enough for uneven stone. My birth parents were not invited. My sister was. She came in a blue dress Mara bought for her because she still spent money on her daughters first and herself last.
She cried.
Too, though softly. After dinner, she pulled me aside and told me she had enrolled in night classes. The girls help with homework, she said, shyly. Turns out I still like learning. I hugged her so hard she laughed into my shoulder. Years passed in the sturdy, surprising way good years do. I finished my doctorate in educational architecture and public space design. June and I founded a small firm focused on rural schools, women's clinics, low-cost libraries, and safe dormitories. Adrian's transport. Data helped us place projects. Elias's policy connections untangled. Permits. Jonah tested everything from ventilation prototypes to clinic equipment placement, because apparently being my brother for decades had turned him into a volunteer design tyrant. Our first major commission was a girls' boarding school 2 counties. From Frost Hollow, I insisted every room have lockable storage, warm, lighting, and at least one wall where students could pin their ambitions. Without asking permission, Mara laughed when she heard that and said I was still the child writing her name on walls. The project that mattered most, though, came later. Frost Hollow's old primary school, where paint peeled from windows and winter winds cut through cracked panes, was finally scheduled for replacement. The county issued a call for design proposals. I submitted ours under the formal name of the firm. On the cover page, in small letters beneath the logo, I added, for the children who have been told, survival is enough, we won. The day I presented the finalized plans in the county hall, my birth, mother sat in the back row. She had grown small, almost delicate with edge, though her eyes remained sharp whenever money was mentioned.
My
father had died the previous year after drinking through a decade of resentment. My half-brother had drifted from job to job and blamed the weather, the government, and women in that order. After the meeting, my mother approached me with the soft steps of someone entering a temple that might yet become a bank. You have done well, she said. So have the Vales, I answered. She looked at the drawings spread on the table. New classrooms. Library. A health room. Dormitory wings with secure bathing areas and windows positioned for privacy. A courtyard with fruit trees.
Ramps.
Skylights. A rainwater garden children could map during science lessons. I had designed the school I would have needed, and many others along. With it, can you help your brother find work? She asked finally. There it was. I had expected the question for years and no longer hated it. Hatred requires energy I preferred to spend elsewhere. There is a vocational retraining office in the county seat, I told her. If he goes, if he stays, and if he learns, someone may hire him. I can send the address. She stared at me as if trying to decide whether this counted as unfilial cruelty or unprofitable fairness. Perhaps it was both. In the end, she took the paper I offered and folded it into her sleeve. That was the nearest thing to peace we ever made. When the new school opened, the whole Vale family stood in the courtyard. Before the ribbon cutting, Mara wore her old teacher's brooch. Anton leaned on his cane and complained that the handrails were too polished, though I caught him wiping his eyes against the winter glare. Adrian inspected the truss
Lines.
Elias read the dedication plaque aloud twice. Jonah knocked on 3 walls, approved the acoustic response, and then stole all the ceremonial candies. The plaque bore the school's official name in large characters. Beneath it, in smaller ones, was the line I had fought the committee to keep. This building is dedicated to every child who was told they were too small, too poor, too late, or too girl to dream. At my insistence, the library inside the school was named the Mara and Anton Vale Reading Room. The scholarship fund attached to it was named for the 4 Vale children, not just the 3 sons everyone once praised. Each year it supports village girls who need exam fees, winter coats, transport, or simply a little evidence that somebody expects them to continue. On opening day, a small girl with rough braids and oversized sleeves stood in the library doorway staring at the books as if they might vanish if she breathed too hard. I knew that look. I had worn it myself. In kitchens, clinics, school gates, and every room where love first felt temporary. I crouched beside her and asked whether she liked stories. She nodded but did not speak. That is fine, I said. You can start by borrowing one.
You do not have
to say anything yet. Some homes teach silence before they teach words. She chose a book about birds. Later, when the speeches were done and the crowd had thinned, I walked alone through the empty classrooms. Sunlight stretched across the desks. The windows held. The floors did not creak. In the dormitory wing, I tested the locks, opened the storage units, and ran my hand along the smooth built-in shelves, 1 shelf in each room, always. Anton's gift had become an architectural principle. Jin found me there eventually. He asked whether the building matched what I had imagined. I told him it was better because imagination had not included the sound of children racing down the corridor already, arguing over who got the beds near the window. He took my hand. From the courtyard came the echo of familiar voices. Mara telling someone to eat more, Anton pretending not to fuss, Adrian explaining load distribution to an 8-year-old, Elias reciting the dedication for anyone who missed it, Jonah teaching the nurse how to fix a loose cabinet hinge without waiting for maintenance. For a moment, I saw my life whole. A girl in a grain sack, a lamp shared by 4 children, 3 scholar, brothers who sharpened pencils, mended straps, mailed notes, and never once let the world convince them I belonged anywhere but beside them. Parents made by action rather than blood. A road that had once led toward abandonment, now branching into schools, clinics, shelter, and light. Years after the school opened, Anton finally retired from the factory. On his last day, the workers presented him with a thermos, a watch he pretended not to like, and a framed photograph of the security team, lined up in clean uniforms. He stood in the doorway afterwards, staring at the picture for so long that Jonah whispered to me, "He is trying not to cry in front of the thermos." Anton did cry, of course. He always did, only later and in private. That evening he polished the watch 3 times and told the same story about the warehouse thieves to anyone who stayed still long enough. Mara listened with the patience of a woman who has loved the same man through poverty, injury, promotion, gray hair, and his inability to accept praise without arguing with it first. Mara retired 2 years after he did, by which point half the county referred to her simply as Teacher Vale, whether or not they had ever sat in her classroom. Former students came back with children of their own and brought peaches, exam papers, wedding candy, or babies for her to hold. She remembered names the way other people remember songs. Sometimes they cried when she did. At her retirement banquet, the County Education Bureau played a slideshow of her old classes. There she was in grainy photographs, younger, thinner, standing before blackboards with chalk dust on her, sleeve and conviction in her eyes. Then the photos shifted to newer. One's Mara at the front gate of the primary school I designed, Mara. Beside scholarship recipients, Mara under banners celebrating record. Reading scores. When the applause finally ended, she took the microphone and said the achievement she was proudest of was not being hired, promoted, or commended. It is this, she said, looking toward our table, that my children grew up believing they were responsible for more than their own comfort. Then, because sentiment embarrasses her almost as much as it embarrassed Anton, she sat down immediately and demanded dessert. My sister's life changed too, though slower than she had once hoped.
She
Finished her night classes, earned a certificate in child development, and eventually found work in a neighborhood child care center near the garment cooperative. Her daughters grew into sharp-eyed girls who corrected adults with polite precision and thought my brothers were comic book heroes in different outfits. The eldest of those girls, Rui, once announced at dinner that she planned to become an aerospace engineer because Uncle Jonah says, machines are only honest if women build them too. Adrian nearly choked on his soup laughing. Elias declared the statement publishable. Jonah denied having said any such thing, then spent the next hour explaining orbital mechanics using dumplings. Those family dinners became our real calendar. Weddings, promotions, grants, births, recoveries, disappointments, book launches, failed. Prototypes, passed exams, everything eventually ended up at the Vale
table.
Adrian brought blueprints. Elias brought impossible cheeses and legal gossip. Jonah brought experimental dessert equipment and at least one minor burn each holiday season. Jen and I brought stories from construction sites. Mara brought order. Anton brought fruit and complaints that translated, if one knew the dialect of his love, into relief. I did not have children immediately. For a while my work consumed me too, fully, and part of me feared motherhood because I had learned it first. As absence and then as rescue. Jen never pushed. We have time, he said, whenever other people grew curious. And if time has taught us anything, it is that family knows many blueprints. When our daughter finally arrived, she came with a furious cry that made the entire delivery ward laugh. Adrian calculated her APGAR scores before the nurse could announce them. Elias wrote a poem before I had finished bleeding. Jonah showed up with a baby monitor he had modified 3 separate times and insisted no commercial version on the market could be trusted. Anton held her as though she were spun sugar. Mara touched the baby's cheek and then mine in the same motion, as if confirming some equation she had solved years earlier, had remained balanced all this time. See, she whispered, no one leaves a daughter on the road in this family. My half-brother drifted in and out of rumor through those years like bad
Weather.
Sometimes he was working construction in another province. Sometimes he had joined a delivery company and quit. Sometimes he was said to be marrying, then not marrying, then borrowing against a future he never seemed to reach. Whenever his name surfaced, I felt very
Little.
not numbness, not anger, only the tired recognition reserved for stories whose endings repeat. Once, however, he came to the city and waited outside my office. I almost did not recognize him. He had my mother's mouth and my father's posture, which made him look like an argument assembled from old mistakes. He congratulated me on the school projects. He admired Joan's car. He praised my good heart with the quick, oily instinct of someone already shaping a request. Then he asked whether I could quietly help him place a down payment on an apartment because his fiance's parents cared about status. I listened all the way through. Then I took him to the public housing information office across the street and showed him where to pick up retraining forms, worker placement notices, and subsidized rental applications. He stared at me, as if I had offered him a sack of gravel instead of salvation. I am your brother, he said. Yes, I replied, which is why I'm giving you something useful instead of something that will only teach you to come back. He left angry.
I
Went upstairs and forgot, within the hour, what shirt he had been wearing. The brothers never forgot how the world first introduced me to them, and in their own strange ways they remained tender about it. Adrian still transferred money labeled books and none of your arguments. Elias still mailed novels with his favorite passages flagged. Jonah still upgraded Locks in every apartment I ever rented and once reprogrammed my office. Lighting because he said architects should not go blind proving other. People deserve windows. When my daughter turned 5, the 3 of them conspired to build her a reading nook under the staircase in our house. Adrian handled the measurements, Elias chose the books, and Jonah insisted on installing dimmable constellation lights that made the tiny ceiling look like weather in another galaxy. When they finished, my daughter crawled inside, looked around with reverent awe, and declared it the best room
In the world,
I stood in the doorway and laughed so hard I had to sit down. Because of course that is what they built her. Not a toy, not a spectacle, but a small defensible kingdom with shelves, lamps, and a
soft rug.
place to become. Sometimes at night, after work is done, and the city has quieted into its mechanical breathing, I think about the design of a life. Not the abstract shape of destiny, but the practical load-bearing details. Who answers a cry, who signs a paper, who walks a road in winter, who comes back when leaving would be easier, who waits with medicine, who shares notes, who teaches a child not merely how to endure, but how to insist on
Joy.
those things are architecture too. And if I have built anything worth keeping in brick, in policy, in classrooms, in my own daughter's certainty that she belongs, it is. Because long ago, 3 scholar brothers and 2 exhausted adults made room for me at their table and treated my future as an object they were duty bound to defend. I was not the most brilliant child in that house. I was never the miracle people point to when they want a neat story about talent rising cleanly from hardship. My life has always been messier, and I think truer than that. I succeeded because love kept arriving and workable. Forms, sharpened pencils, bus fare, secondhand coats, corrected drafts, shared broth, legal advice, repaired lamps, stubborn faith, and the quiet repetition of one message until I finally believed it. Stay, study, eat, rest. Try again. You are ours. That sentence, spoken 1,000 different ways, rebuilt me from the inside out. People sometimes ask whether I believe luck changed my fate. I do not. Luck may have placed the veil cart on that winter road at the exact hour. My father's resolve failed. Luck may have let me hear the crying. Grandson at the river fair may have spared Anton's spine, may have nudged my exam paper toward the right questions, may have introduced me to June on a project deadline and not a year later. But luck is not what raised me. I was raised by a woman who heard a child crying and called that sound an obligation. By a man who built shelves and walked limp-kneed to bus stops before dawn. By 3 brothers who treated my future as family, property, and guarded it with all the seriousness other people reserve for land, titles, or sons. So when I'm asked where I come from, I no longer say Frost Hollow. First, I say I come from a winter house with 1 lamp, 4 desks that took turns being a table, 3 scholar brothers who spoiled me in practical ways, and 2 parents who taught me that being wanted is not a miracle. It is a discipline. It is a choice made again and again, especially when making it cost something. And because they chose me, I learned how to choose others. That, in the end, is the only legacy worth inheriting.